This program has been brought to you in part through the generous support of the Hawaii State Legislature and Stephen T. Sawyer. The Center for Labor Education and Research, University of Hawaii West Oahu presents a Rice and Roses production.
Family of Jack Hall, brothers, sisters, and friends. Eulogies are difficult under any circumstances, and close to impossible under these. Saying goodbye to a dear friend, a fighting comrade, a man who did so much to reshape Hawaii. Jack was one of the finest sons of the working class. The day he went to sea, he knew his lot was the lot of the working man, and never was there a breach in his thinking. He had an abiding faith and confidence in the power of men and women who labor for a living, to form and run their own organizations, to determine their own destinies and be a decisive power for change and progress. This became the story of his life.
Jack Wayne Hall was born on February 28, 1915 in Ashland, Wisconsin. His Irish-French-Canadian father, John Percival Hall, worked as a clearing and dyeing plant operator. His mother, Alma Swanson Hall, of Swedish descent, was born in Ashland. Their unhappy marriage led to Alma's suicide in 1919. Jack was only 4 years old, but the event haunted him all his life.
It had a huge impact on his life. When I first knew Jack, he told me his mother had died of the flu. Much later, he told me that his mother committed suicide. He really had not gotten over that. Yoshiko Hall.
The family moved to Los Angeles, and John Percival remarried. Jack had a tough, unhappy childhood and a bitter relationship with his father. He attended Washington Elementary School and in 1931 graduated at 16 from Huntington Park High School.
I know that he had a scholarship to go to college, but it didn't cover everything, room and board, and there wasn't money for whatever the scholarship didn't cover, so he had to work.
If there ever was a time when in our history people were without hope, it was the Depression years of the early 1930s. Few of our families could afford to send us on for higher education. Jobs were too scarce to work our way through college. Hundreds of thousands of my generation left home to bum around the country in hopes of picking up a casual odd job for a few days. My wonderful grandmother gave me the then princely sum of $5 from her carefully hoarded egg money, a change of clothes and a pillow slip, a warm kiss goodbye, and I was on my way to my destiny.
Jack hitched a ride to San Francisco and got a job as an ordinary seaman. For the next 3 years, he worked on different ships. After seeing poverty and colonial oppression in Asia, he began to read left-wing literature and befriended other sailors who were interested in socialism. He joined the Sailors' Union of the Pacific.
It seems that workers in the maritime trades, whether they're on board ships or on shore, have had radical traditions. So those traditions were in place in the workforce, both on the ships and along the shore, at the time of the organizing drives of the early 30s.
In July of 1934, Jack found himself in San Francisco in the midst of the West Coast Longshore strike.
In the longshore industry, the hiring process on a daily basis was so corrupt. So the objectives of the strike, along with some wage demands and so forth, but was to change the whole relationship between the workers in the industry that was setting a standard and example for workers in other industries.
Bloody Thursday, July 5th, was the day that I hit San Francisco, and the Hawaiians were involved in that strike in large numbers and ran almost as a group. They were considered the toughest gang of guys when it came to going after scabs. At that time, I was more or less convinced that there were two people who could walk on water, and Harry Bridges was one of them.
By the end of the day, there were 2 workers shot and killed by the police, and hundreds more were injured. The longshoremen of that day established a standard for militant democratic unionism that has been a beacon for workers in this country and elsewhere ever since.
Jack made Honolulu his home port in 1935. When ashore, he helped the Sailors Union by writing and distributing leaflets. He also worked on the labor publication The Voice of Labor.
When I first met him, he was as skinny as a rail. He didn't see very well, and I remember when he was working on The Voice of Labor, he'd hold up the paper right close to his eyes so that he would know exactly what he had written and what he was writing.
What an impressive looking guy when you first saw him, you know, all this 6 feet 4 inches tall. And he has a kind of looks that would melt ice, you know. He's got that determined looks about him.
He was putting all of his energy and dedication into organizing the working class. He believed workers would unite in a world revolution and become leaders of their countries. He joined the Communist Party in 1936.
The others were more flamboyant in their tactics and the way they talked about the trade unions. But Jack basically was the intellectual.
I was a merchant seaman and had the opportunity to visit the colonial countries of Asia and see the contempt of the white Anglo-Saxons for the Oriental people. Hawaii was not much different. The economic ruling class, exclusively white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, treated the non-white workers as ignorant creatures.
In Hawaii, the odds were heavily against union organizing. A group of corporations known as the Big Five controlled Hawaii's economy. They owned land, sugar and pineapple companies, shipping lines, hotels, and retail stores. With interlocking boards of directors, their influence extended far beyond the corporate realm and into all branches of the territorial government. They were ready to fight for their economic advantages and were a formidable adversary.
Thousands of immigrants were brought to these islands in successive waves by the sugar plantations under a policy of divide and rule. They were put in miserable shacks, in racially segregated plantation camps. These islands are not a miraculous land of aloha different from the mainland. Here too is violence, hatred, and fear, stemming from the same cause, injustice.
Everybody was in the same boat, so there was not like trying to keep up with the Jones or your neighbors, because everybody was down and out.
I used to go to Wailoa High School, and after school, like 2 o'clock, I would work out in the field out there. From 2 to 6, my dad told me, don't make trouble. That's the life of the immigrant people.
There had been early attempts to protest and strike against unfair conditions and poor wages in Hawaii, but they were generally unsuccessful because there was no solidarity between the different races.
Well, that's how all the unions failed, because when the Filipinos went on strike, the Japanese refused to help them, and when the Japanese went on strike, the Filipinos said, no, I got you, I'm not going to help you. You do it on your own. And so, everybody failed.
In April of 1937, Jack is sent to Kauai to help settle the Port Allen strike and to organize workers. The 80-day strike tested Hall's mettle and established him as a union organizer.
To me, the fact that he came to Hawaii at the time that he did and was able to elucidate the nature of the industry to the workers so that they could understand why they needed to organize unions was his greatest gift to us.
On and off for the next 4 years, Jack spends a great deal of time when he is not at sea organizing on the island of Kauai. He is employed by CIO Local 76 of the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers, Yukapawa, for $16 per month. Marxism, youthful fervor, and an unshakable belief in trade unionism fueled his spare existence.
People who see the reality and have a passion which is built on compassion can't sit on the sidelines.
Jack lived in the dusty town of Hanapepe at the Watase Hotel. He had 2 changes of clothes and sometimes collected bottles for refunds in order to eat. Heavy drinking was becoming an established part of his lifestyle.
I think all of his friends probably and half the rest of the world knew that he drank too much.
He developed excellent writing skills and was constantly writing and editing labor publications. Organizing was done at a grassroots level, talking to people in bars and parks, meetings at workers' houses at night with the kerosene lamps turned low in fear of camp police.
There was a big gate at the entrance to the main camp, and people had to really stop the visitors and walk over to the little station house and get permit. I'm going to visit the Shiromas. Are you related to the Shiromas? Are you going to stay overnight? How long are you going to stay? And this was a means that they used to control the workers.
We used to have lots and lots of meetings and lots of interest. And of course, the meetings would go on 5 or 6 hours, because in those days they had to be conducted in 3, sometimes 4 languages. And we used to go right into the camp, even though they had trespass laws, and defy them to throw us out. Sometimes they would take you out, but we went right back in. Those were great days.
Hall encouraged labor to take a proactive role in politics. In 1938, he began the Kauai Progressive League, an organization devoted to registering voters and electing candidates that supported labor.
They knew that the political power was the key, because political power was the thing that had been repressing them, that had been the thing that had been used to get the injunctions against them and to have the police come and beat them up and kick them out and all that kind of stuff.
A longshore strike broke out at Ahukini Landing on Kauai in July of 1940, lasting 298 days, the longest strike in Hawaiian history. Jack worked tirelessly for the strikers and served as an advisor on the settlement.
We don't mingle with haoles those days, you know. The only haoles we see is the bosses of the plantation, you know. No, but then here's a haole guy coming from nowhere, and his name is Jack Hall, and he's helping us. From that day on, I really felt, well, there shouldn't be a racial discrimination, you know.
The Ahukini strike was not materially successful, but it was highly significant.
This was the first clear case of workers walking out in support of another group in the islands, even though it was made up of another race.
1941 found Hall in Honolulu. At the home of friends, he is introduced to Yoshiko Ogawa, and there is an instant rapport between the 2 young people.
Boy, I fell in love with Jack Hall the first night, and then he called me the next day. I really didn't expect to see him again. I was still going to the university, working my way. I had about 5 different jobs.
My mother was from the Big Island. She was from a town called then Ola'a. Now it's called Keau. She had 6 brothers and sisters that lived. Her father worked for Ola'a Plantation.
For the United States, World War II began on December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Hawaii was immediately placed under martial law. The military controlled nearly every aspect of civilian life. All resources were instantly directed into the war effort, and labor organizing came to a standstill.
The military government issued orders freezing plantation workers to their jobs at the request of the plantations. Military control of labor was in effect plantation management dictatorship over labor supported by army bayonets.
In fact, the manager of the company was himself like the martial law representative. He had an old tin hat and he had a 45 slung on the side of his hips, and he would proudly come down to the morning assembly, to let everybody see who he was and what he represented.
The plantations made a substantial profit on loaning labor out to the military, in fact, greater than the regular rate of profit. Plantation workers were forced to work at a lower classification rate than those being paid directly on Army payrolls.
They were able to have sugar workers work on jobs and get paid only what they were being paid at the time as sugar workers. The mainland defense workers were paid $1.75 an hour. They were only paid 19 cents an hour. And everything over 19 cents an hour was paid to the sugar industry. So, all kinds of hanky-panky was going on under martial law.
Jack Hall and Yoshiko Ogawa were married on January 12, 1942, in a private ceremony.
They could read each other's minds, and there was very deep love between them. Nobody who knew them could ever question that.
Jack's father did not approve.
When Jack wrote him a letter and told him we were going to get married, his father said he would come down and shoot me. Shoot the Japs.
Yoshiko's family was also upset.
Oh, hell, my mother was disowned. I remember her telling me that her father said that Jack, who had less arm hair than I have, was as hairy as a monkey, and that you should never marry a barbarian.
During the war, Jack applied for a position at the Territorial Department of Labor and Industrial Relations.
He was what is called a wage inspector. He went around to see that the employers paid money, the right kinds of money, to the workers who worked under their particular aegis.
On the job, Jack learned accounting and how to read financial statements. He traveled throughout the islands and met people in key positions. He learned all about the Fair Labor Standards Act and how to navigate government red tape.
God damn it, I think hours and wages inspectors and Mormon missionaries are the only people in Oahu wearing a coat and tie.
In February of 1943, the Halls have their first child, Michelle. They are both devoted parents. By 1944, martial law restrictions were easing. Unfair treatment under military rule and the disparity of wages paid to war workers from the mainland caused local laborers to look at trade unions with renewed interest. Louis Goldblatt, Secretary-Treasurer of the ILWU, the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, had been studying the situation in Hawaii for some time. He realized that establishing a strong union in the islands would take more than organizing the longshoremen.
The only way to tackle Hawaii was to tackle the Big Five, and their source of power was in two key fields, sugar and pineapple. If you couldn't make it there, you couldn't make it. Louis Goldblatt.
In March of 1944, Matt Meehan, the ILWU International Secretary, went to Hawaii to pick a regional director. And in June, Jack Hall became the regional director at a salary of $75 a week. The job required a willingness to work 25 hours a day, 8 days a week.
Everybody who was a regional director on for the next 30, 40 years were the most dedicated and the most committed and the most intelligent of the leadership of the ILWU, who were willing to make this incredible sacrifice of their personal lives in order to play this role.
As soon as the war ended, in a brilliant move in September of 1945, Jack hired San Francisco lawyer Richard Gladstein to file complaints charging 39 sugar, pineapple, and other companies with several violations of the Fair Labor and Standards Act. In out-of-court settlements, the companies eventually paid over $1.5 million for back wages. Jack's first goal was to organize workers to bring about a majority representation as quickly as possible.
When we first met Jack at the meeting, we figured he was just another howler we figured that he'll be talking to us here today and he'll be gone tomorrow. He'll be gone tomorrow. But that wasn't all. He was always there. Every time we have a meeting, Jack was there.
A major step in organizing sugar and pineapple came when the National Labor Relations Board ruled that bargaining units could include all plantation workers except those involved in cultivating and harvesting. Early union members ran the risk of getting fired if they were caught signing up their fellow workers.
In order to get in the union, we got to sign them up. So I figure I'll devise a situation for myself to be protected too at the same time. And we had the stalls of toilets, 6, 7. So I would sit in the middle of the stalls, the number 3 or number 4, and I would pass the card underneath the barriers. And I would say, Chris, this is Eddie. Sign that card right away and give it back to me. And don't tell anybody. In 2-3 days, we signed over 100 cards.
Union membership grew at a rapid pace. In January of 1944, the union had 970 members. A year later, that figure was nearing 7,000. Racial unity and multiracial leadership became the backbone of the ILWU.
We enforced, of course, multiracial leadership, irrespective of abilities, which bothered some people because they felt it wasn't democratic. And so we had everybody in leadership in one fashion or another, and everyone felt part of it.
Even though we had leaders in the ILWU on the mainland that believed in the principle of racial integration and solidarity of all peoples regardless of race, creed, nationality, and so forth, is that it was out of Hawaii that this had a living representation in the life of the union.
Through skill, honesty, and a dedication to problem solving, Jack was able to hold the diverse membership together.
We can fight like hell in the meeting, but when we are over, we're all in unison. Our mind is the same.
Each island was encouraged to develop their own leaders and their own power bases. As regional director, Hall worked closely with local leaders.
Jack has always been a person who had a liking for me. And Jack assigned me to go out and help organize. And I didn't know nothing about organizing. But, when you love a man like him, and when he asks you a question, you got to try.
I think he really believed in that principle of that the leadership should be very close to the membership. And I think that's demonstrated throughout the history of ILWU, but I think it's also demonstrated by the kind of guy he was.
To further solidarity, all union chapters were consolidated into one unit, ILWU 142.
Unless you have that kind of strength behind you, and unless you can shut down every single plantation on every island, field to mill, you couldn't win. Sooner or later, the split would take place, either industrially, island by island, race by race. All these things had to be coopered up. Louis Goldblatt.
Hall once again set up political action committees and instructed ILWU leaders to get their people to register to vote. His goal was to get as many candidates as possible elected to the legislature where labor laws were written.
independent political action is carried on first, in the interest of our own ILWU members and their families. Second, in the interest of trade unionism and unorganized workers. And third, in the interest of the community as a whole. Now, in practically all cases, the interests of all three are the same.
Those days, politics was so important to us. You know, I can say this because I've been involved in politics, not as a lead person, but going out campaign house to house, passing brochures at the job site.
The slogan was, you punish the one that hurt you, and you help the one that helped you. And as far as this union is concerned, we help the Democrats if they help us, and we help the Republicans.
In the 1944 election, 15 ILWU-endorsed candidates were elected to the House of Representatives and 6 to the Senate. The Union emerged as a new political power. With legislators friendly to labor, Hall's Little Wagner Act passed in May of 1945, giving agricultural workers involved in cultivating and harvesting the right to organize. A year later, 20,000 out of 24,000 sugar workers had joined the ILWU. The union now had a fighting chance to challenge the status quo. The 1946 sugar contract negotiation was the first significant showdown between union and employers. Negotiations failed, and the sugar workers went out on strike on September 1st. The union wanted better wages and an end to the perquisite system, a system of free housing, medical, and fuel, through which the plantation controlled the lives of workers. Workers who fell out of line could easily be evicted.
The employers kept talking about free houses, and many of our own guys talked about his free house. We got free houses, we got free water. We say, shit, what do you mean you got it free? You're making 24 cents an hour. How in the hell is that goddamn thing free? Louis Goldblatt.
During the strike, Jack was learning the fine art of negotiating from Goldblatt, whose experience was far greater than Hall's. And Jack was a fast learner, eager and anxious to absorb whatever he could.
He and Lou were really tight. They were political allies, they were intellectual friends. They both had the same kind of breadth of interest.
The strike lasted 79 days and was a tremendous victory for the union. For the first time in Hawaii's history, employers were stymied and were forced to recognize the voice of their workers. Workers were awed and inspired by the power of trade unionism as an instrument for change.
No boss or combination of bosses is strong enough to lick the working people, so long as they have unity and solidarity, a confidence in their ability to win, and a conviction that it is better to go down fighting than to live life on your knees.
Before the union came in, we always walked with our head down. Whatever the company tell you, and you better listen. When the union came in, we walked with our head up.
It is the awakening, as it were, of all of the workers' feelings about themselves, their families, their jobs. And to me, this is the story of the awakening of the human spirit through a group called a union, which allows them to talk about what are the things that are important.
The employers retaliated by trying to discredit union leaders with accusations of communism. The daily newspapers, both of which were anti-union, gladly lent themselves to the purpose.
They figured that with the development of the Cold War, the McCarthy period, that perhaps they could break the union on a red baiting campaign. And they began to hammer away.
Yoshiko Hall was discharged from her position as a social worker with the Department of Public Welfare in 1948. Her supervisor said one of the reasons was that he suspected her of being a communist.
I felt that all he wanted to do was to bring a better life for the working people in Hawaii. The inequities were just too great. I never questioned that he was doing the right thing. Yoshiko Hall.
I think she was devoted to the cause too, because it was after all part of her background too, her family's life and the people that she grew up with.
Crisis in Honolulu, caught like the rest of Hawaii in the paralyzing grip of a dockman's strike. The tie-up, which has
During the long and explosive dock strike of 1949, employers and their supporters fueled community fear of communism while publicly accusing union leaders of taking orders from Moscow. The longshoremen worked the same cargo and the same ships as longshoremen on the mainland and felt they were entitled to the same pay. It was a major challenge to the Big Five and their colonial wage pattern. The union fought against the wealth and power of the employers, against arrests, court actions, a governor who sided with business, and the daily attacks of a hostile press. The wives and daughters of employers even picketed the strikers.
Those were the days when those women used to picket the broom brigade. They used to have these cars and loudspeakers which kept going around town denouncing the union. Yoshiko Hall.
The really disgraceful thing about it was where some of these rich women who didn't want to take their turn in the picket line would take their maids down to do their turn. Louis Goldblatt.
I used to love it when there was a strike because of the soup kitchens and the camaraderie and all the entertainment. And I remember being severely chastised one time when I actually said, "Oh, this is so much fun. I wish there were more strikes."
I thought that, for example, that saffron was poor people food, because when there was a strike, you always had frog's legs with saffron, and I think they must have stolen it off the ships.
The 6-month strike was won by the union with the help and support of the ILWU membership on the Pacific Coast. The victory signaled the end of economic dictatorship by the Big Five and guaranteed labor a place at the table of island economics.
When the real history books of these islands are written, when we pause to look at the past struggles of workers in these islands, the Longshore strike in 1949 will stand out as a monument to the resistance of the little people.
But this success did not stop the attempts to split the Union over the so-called Red Issue. An anti-communist witch hunt was sweeping the nation, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy. Because it has never been illegal for anyone in the United States to belong to the Communist Party or any other political party, people were prosecuted for violation of the Smith Act, which forbids knowingly or willfully advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government by force or violence. People with communist, socialist, or liberal affiliations were indiscriminately accused of violating the Smith Act and plotting violent revolution.
It was during a period about which we can't be very proud of. People lost their jobs as a result. People also committed suicide because the weight was so heavy.
The people were scared, and neighbors were turned against neighbors, and families were broken up in some cases. It was awful.
The point is that what was happening after World War II was an effort to dismantle that successful, radical democratic leadership across the board.
Though Hall, like many trade unionists, had socialist values, he had long outgrown the revolutionary ideas of his younger years and was no longer a member of the Communist Party. His allegiance was to the ILWU and whatever would advance the Union.
Certainly for those who live in our nation, who are so exploited by the present situation, they should feel, or they should know, that these individuals truly believed that there was a different way of ordering the economic system which would make for better happiness, for better realization of one's self.
He thought that communists in the United States were not pragmatic and that the things that they wanted wouldn't work, and that he was very pragmatic.
In April of 1950, at the urging of Territorial Governor Ingram Steinbach, the House Committee on Un-American Activities came to investigate communism in Hawaii. Jack Hall was called before the committee. He and 39 others, known as the Reluctant 39, all pled the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer any questions. They were charged with contempt of court, but later acquitted on constitutional grounds. Hall filed a customary non-communist affidavit with the National Labor Relations Board.
I filed a sworn affidavit declaring that I was not then, at least, a member of the Communist Party. I was not required to do so. I did so because there were cannibalistic unions trying to split and divide us. Now, if the affidavit were fraudulent, does anyone in their right mind believe for even a minute that I would not have been prosecuted for perjury?
In July of 1951, a disgruntled and resentful member of the ILWU and former member of the Communist Party was urged by a local lawyer to go to Washington and testify in a closed-door session before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
The desertion of the weak, the greedy, the selfish, and the self-styled union leaders seeking their security at the expense of the rank and file has not weakened this union. It has made us stronger. It has tempered us in a crucible of fire.
After the testimony, the U.S. Attorney General's office decided to come to Hawaii to make Smith Act prosecutions. On August 28, 1951, Jack Hall was arrested at 6:30 a.m. on violation of the Smith Act.
What I remember is that my mother woke me up and told me that he had been arrested and that she didn't know exactly why. And I do remember my mother saying, "It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay."
6 other persons besides Hall were arrested: Charles and Eileen Fujimoto, John Reinecke, James Freeman, Koji Ariyoshi, and Jack Kimoto. Collectively, they were called the Hawaii Seven. Though released on bail, Jack faced a taxing court battle. There were long hearings, and the trial itself would drag on for 6 months.
I don't know how I survived it or how Jack survived it, because he carried on his job. He used to go to work really early, leave the house about 6. He'd work, and then he'd be in court nearly all day. Went back to the office, get whatever work he had to get done. Yoshiko Hall.
And of course, Jack should never have been dragged into that trial anyway. He shouldn't have been in there, and it was a union-busting tactic. The government needed a device to cripple unions, and that was a good one.
One of Jack's main concerns throughout this ordeal was the union's well-being. Against the advice of his lawyers, he delivered a statement to the rank and file.
I would do nothing to hurt this union. I've dedicated practically my entire adult life to building it. And in the span of years, I have worked through and with any group or individual who, in my mind, I thought had something to contribute to building and strengthening the union in this territory. Any other policy, in view of the violent, shrewd, and almost overwhelming opposition of the Big Five, would have been naive and unrealistic. I drew the line at no one and no group, and I would not do so today.
Support from the rank and file was overwhelming and included testimonial dinners and events on all islands.
Communism was depicted as some big red boogeyman, and they'll come and, take over overthrow the government by force and violence. And, any common sense will tell you that this was not possible. And so we kind of left it off, and everybody concentrated on what the union was doing.
At that time, political situation never meant anything important to me, because The only political situation I believe in was the Union.
In June of 1953, a jury handed down a guilty verdict for all 7 defendants. The judge gave Hall the maximum sentence of 5 years in prison and a fine of $5,000. After hearing the verdict, 26,000 rank-and-file members of the ILWU protested with a walkout. The trial was over. Jack was out on bail, and the long, slow process of appeal was set in motion. It was during this time that Jack was diagnosed with diabetes.
And Jack really suffered. He suffered a lot from the Smith Act trial. The cost to a defendant in those trials is, a lot of it is not appreciated by the public.
Under the uncertain shadow of a jail sentence, Jack Hall picked up the threads of daily life. In June of 1954, he and Yoshiko had a second child, Eric Mitsugi Hall.
He was a very, very good father. The kids just adored him. Mikey thought the world of him. Yoshiko Hall.
In his personal relationships, he was warm, but you had to find out. You had to work at it a little bit to bring it out in him. He laughed a lot, and with his friends, he was very warm and easy to get along with and fun to be around. He was a great cook, gourmet cook.
My mother worked, which when I was growing up was unusual to have the mother working. And they shared a lot of the household chores, which I think was really different from a lot of other families. I mean, he helped do everything.
He liked the outdoors, liked nature, liked walking. We walked from Ho'onau down to Mililii.
He swam a lot. I used to worry he wouldn't find the shore because he took off his glasses. One time we were in Waimanalo and he didn't come back. Well, he was lost. He couldn't see the shore. He had been out there for about 3 hours. I started a bonfire. He said if I hadn't thought of it, he would be lost.
He really liked jazz and Louis Armstrong records, or Nat King Cole before he sang the piano music. Sidney Bechet and people like that, they loved all that stuff.
Kinds of values that my parents instilled in me and my brother were to care about other people, to contribute back to society, not to be a leech, to fight for those who can't fight for themselves or who don't have a voice.
Hall and the ILWU campaigned hard for their candidates in the 1954 elections. For the first time in over 50 years, the Democrats gained control of the territorial legislature.
The ILWU, out of all proportion to its size, became a very powerful political medium. They were close to John Burns and to his successors, and I think that at that point, the islands became irretrievably democratic.
The Smith Act appeal continued. New York lawyer Telford Taylor, who served as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, took Hall's appeal. The appeal was argued before the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco.
It's irritating as hell not to know where they stand.
In 1957, a U.S. Supreme Court case set a precedent regarding Smith Act convictions, and in 1958, the Hawaii Seven were acquitted, 6 years after their arrest. Under Jack Hall's leadership, the tremendous change that the ILWU had forged in little more than a decade could no longer be denied.
While the morass out of which we have climbed is not a pretty one, we are not bitter about the past or against those who were responsible for the suffering and the indignities of those days. It is to the credit of the men of industry in Hawaii that, with few exceptions, they have changed with the times. Relations are maturing, and mutual respect and fair dealings are the order of the day.
And a new kind of manager emerged, one younger, one who felt that labor was here to stay and unions needed to be negotiated with and grievances needed to be addressed, and if there were things wrong, they needed to be righted.
Jack had a reputation for being a negotiator with impeccable integrity. He had become an expert at bargaining and could cost out a contract in his head.
There's moments in bargaining where things start to move, and so you really have to understand the economics of what you're doing in order to do the best job for the folks you represent. And he could do that kind of stuff in his head.
Jack was honest. You know, I tell you this, Jack was honest. Even the management people respected Jack, although they don't agree with him all the time.
Hawaii became a state in 1959 and could elect its own governor. In 1962, the Union and the Asian American community rallied behind gubernatorial candidate John Burns. Jack Hall led the victory campaign that made John Burns governor. Jack Hall became the confidant of Governor Burns and one of the most powerful political figures in Hawaii. No longer considered a rebel, Hall became involved in civic affairs. He was on the governing boards of many community organizations and served as a director of the Hawaii Visitors Bureau and president of the Hawaii Council for Housing Actions.
The ILWU was very much involved as a constructive force in the community. Jack Hall was one of the people who remade the old community chest into the Aloha United Way.
As early as the 1950s, the ILWU took successful steps to cushion the impact of mechanization on the workforce. Jack Hall was also instrumental in developing insurance programs to protect the health and welfare of working people. By 1965, the United States was sending troops to fight in Vietnam. It was a war that Jack Hall was morally opposed to. He and 38 others participated in one of the first anti-war marches in Hawaii.
We regard this war as immoral, illegal, and contrary to our American national interest. An excerpt from a statement.
What people didn't realize, of course, that the opponents of the war were exercising the highest degree of patriotism. And that included Jack. Jack loved the country and everything about it, and the war was a horrible thing for the country, and he had sense enough to recognize that.
We are not being told the truth much of the time on what is happening today in foreign countries. Our politicians, our newspapers, and other mass media either ignore or distort the truth, or are not competent to observe what is going on and report it factually. We refuse to accept the concept that in relations with foreign countries, we must support our country's politicians, right or wrong. Americans who criticize our government's foreign policy are frequently charged with being anti-American and disloyal. Is it anti-American to try and understand what another person believes and what they are driving at, whether you agree with them or not? There is no disloyalty in this. And there is no disloyalty in knowing what you are talking about or in seeing things as they really are in the world today.
The ILWU in Hawaii continued to grow. Membership expanded to include the general trades and tourism. By the late 1960s, Local 142 represented about 35% of the ILWU international membership and exerted considerable power. Local 142 was a model of solidarity and always voted as a unit. Anyone who wanted to run for international office needed their support. While Jack's friendship with Lou Goldblatt deepened over the years, his relationship with ILWU International President Harry Bridges became more strained.
Jack was a very real person. He was also vulnerable. Jack could be injured. He could be hurt emotionally. He didn't show it much. You had to know him pretty well to know when he was His feelings were hurt.
In 1969, Hall was nominated as an ILWU International Officer and became the Vice President, Director of Organization. Hall was eager for a new challenge, and the family moved to San Francisco.
It was the first time that somebody from Hawaii was elected to international office. It was a formal recognition of the importance of the Hawaii experience and the legacy of the ILWU in Hawaii to the entire Union.
Well, I think that he was glad to make the move in terms of what he thought needed to be done within the Union. I don't think he was glad to make the move in terms of where, I mean, it wasn't Hawaii. It's not, I mean, he loved Hawaii. He liked the people here. He liked the way it looks. How can you not?
The Halls set up housekeeping on Yerba Buena Avenue, and Hall immersed himself in his new job. Before the move, he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, but as always, he looked to the future and continued to keep up a rigorous work schedule.
I tried to get him not to go to work on many a day. He insisted on going. Yoshiko Hall.
He was sick and getting sicker all the time and drinking more all the time. Yoshiko had a hard problem with his drinking.
With Hall and Bridges in close quarters, their difficulties grew.
Oh, they were careful not to go public with it. That would have been very hard on the Union. Both of them loved the Union. Both of them had the interests of the Union at heart.
If we can just concentrate on what they accomplished, that is the important thing, despite all of the differences, personal and otherwise, that they may have had with each other, because that is what pushes the labor movement ahead.
Hall had ideas about merging ILWU units in the San Jose area. He pushed for additional organizing in Alaska and campaigned for bringing the Hawaii Government Employees Association into the ILWU. He had been approached by Cesar Chavez and urged the ILWU to move aggressively into organizing the California farm workers. His plans never moved forward due to his illness and differences within the ILWU.
And I know that made him very depressed, my father, that he wanted to push the boundaries, that the ILWU could have been much more, could have done things for other people in the mainland like they had done here.
Though his health was rapidly declining, he soldiered on and continued to work. By the fall of 1970, he was half paralyzed and needed help getting dressed and combing his hair.
He was really frustrated. He hated that his body was falling apart, that he couldn't do things, that he couldn't do for himself. It made him depressed, and I think he thought initially that he would get better.
In December, he was hospitalized for 10 days. Once home, he seemed to improve a little, surrounded by the love and care of his family. But on New Year's Day, he suffered a stroke. He died at Kaiser Hospital on Geary Street on January 2nd, 1971. He was 56 years old. In Hawaii, as a tribute to Jack Hall, on January 7th at 10 a.m., 40,000 government workers and 23,000 ILWU members stopped work. That same night, crowds gathered at the Honolulu International Center for his memorial service.
Each of us grieves in our own way, and mostly, I suppose, in those quiet moments when we're alone. And almost all of us use the word loss when we talk about something like the death of Jack Hall. We can no more lose Jack Hall than we can lose part of ourselves. Hawaii cannot lose Jack Hall any more than they can turn back the clock 35 years and undo the changes that have been made. The word loss is wrong, but I know I speak for everyone here when I say we're going to miss him, and miss him with an overwhelming ache. An era is ending.
On January 20th, Jack Hall's ashes were scattered at sea, off the islands that had become his home.
If I am to be remembered for anything in these islands, I'd like to be thought of as a rebel in paradise. Just one of the guys who struck a spark for a flame that was kept burning. We were able to keep it burning. Because of that, working people won dignity, self-respect, and a chance to determine their own destinies.
This program has been brought to you in part through the generous support of the Hawaii State Legislature and Stephen T. Sawyer.
Can we just go back again to that question of why Jack Hall shouldn't have been put on trial?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. As I said, it was a union-busting tactic that the federal government decided to try to use. And some FBI men went to David Thompson, who was education director for 142, the local union, and made an offer to him and asked him to convey the offer to Jack that they would withdraw the Smith Act charges against him if he would take Local 142 out of the ILWU International. And David was smart enough to play possum and lay low, and he said, well, I got to think about it, and of course I have to talk with Jack about it. It's up to him, and come back tomorrow. And in the intervening period, David wired his house, and these donkeys, the FBI is supposed to protect us from tactics like this, but they fell for it completely. They came back the next day and repeated the same offer, and it was all taped. And Bob McElrath, who later to become president of Local 142, got it all on tape, and he had a radio program, a daily talk show of some sort, and he played it over and over and over again, many times every day. He played that tape recorder of the FBI making that offer, totally illegal and totally uncalled for, and totally unethical and dishonest, and there it was, all on tape.
Now, the situation, no doubt, has changed. The public unions have become the largest single union in town, simply because with the disappearance of sugar and the almost complete disappearance of pineapple in both instances, we have lost membership. We have lost that base which provided us with the political action that was so needed in the early days. And public workers, well, they figure they have their clutches on the legislature and they can dictate. And it seems to me that that is another one of the problems that the members in private trade unions need to look at. Where is the real power supposed to lie, and who should exercise it? Do you do it cooperatively? Do you have one group telling you exactly what the other group should do? You know, this is almost a complete reversal of what happened in the early days. And with the coming of statehood, let's face it, the whole political economy has changed so rapidly that private industries no longer hold the kind of power that they once held. We think of it as, oh, well, maybe residing in hotels. But who knows how long that particular industry is going to last. See, so there are many things that are occurring in the labor movement to which you must pay attention so that your future strategy will take care of what happens to the ability to continue people in trade unions and to organize them into trade unions. The fact that we already have a crisis on our hands, the change to win unions. You know, when you consider the fact that at one time we had 30% of the American working class in unions, now we're lucky if we have 12%. So there are major, major problems facing the trade unions, and we will also face them here, perhaps not quite in the same fashion or as quickly as that faced by the trade union movement on the mainland. We must think of different ways in which to grow.
Now, where was your mother from, and what kind of family background did she have?
She was from Ola'a on the Big Island. It's now what's called Keau, I think. And so it's a sugar plantation town. Her dad was a really interesting guy. He was the second son. He was supposed to be the priest, and in fact, in Japan, he was the priest, and he abandoned his family in Japan to come first to California, actually first to Hawaii. He had never done manual labor, hated it, and left, and he got caught in California, and they brought him back to Hawaii. And then he became a mason. So their lives were better than most sugar workers because he was a more skilled worker. He had a house that was apart from the other plantation workers, and there was a certain tension around that. But they also had more resources. But it's a kind of a funny thing. I mean, my mom talked about how when she was little, she would ask her father for a nickel to go to the movies, and he said, "Why? You saw one 6 months ago." So things were tough for them too, but they were less tough than they were for the people who were field workers. She also talked about how she had to work in the fields and that she used to get beat up by the Lunas because she would mouth off. And she talked about one of the reasons for her deafness was she'd been struck in the head by somebody, by a field boss. So she wanted to get out of Ola and that kind of life, and so she came to Honolulu to go to university. In fact, she'd been admitted to Smith, which is amazing for somebody of her generation and of her social background. But they didn't have the money for it, so she came to Honolulu in a cattle boat with $5. That's how she got here.
I don't think that anybody really understood what forces would be unleashed in support of the strike in the aftermath of those terrible events of Bloody Thursday. For one thing, it awakened the conscience of certain sections of organized labor that had been reluctant to take official stands in support of the strike. And the funeral procession and the service for the slain strikers took place on the 9th of July, and it was a massive silent procession up Market Street that was watched by thousands and thousands, up to 50,000 people were there, and it triggered debates and discussions in the San Francisco Labor Council that led eventually to a declaration of a general strike in San Francisco, where all workers who belonged to unions and many who did not in support put down the tools of their trades, closed the doors of the businesses in support of the strikers' demands. And the fact that there was a general strike, which was at that time only the second or third in the history of the United States, shook the world. It wasn't just here, but it also triggered the use of force by the state apparatus, including the National Guard, was brought out in order to quiet the streets of San Francisco, to protect private property and business, and also to support the disruption of the strike apparatus, because the police and vigilantes went in and broke up various offices where strike support activities were held. But there was a sense that there was a changing of the political terrain in terms of conducting a strike as a result of the escalation and the tragedies of July 5th and the support for those strikers and what was going to happen in other industries, because what was happening in Longshore in terms of the numbers of workers involved was small compared to what was happening in a similar kind of unionism, democratic industrial unionism, in steel, in mining, in the auto industry, and the rubber industry. But it was a kind of leadership by example, even if by numbers, that radiated across the country. And certainly up and down the Pacific coast, because not all ports were as unified in support of the strike as in San Francisco. And often in ports in the Northwest and down south in San Pedro, Los Angeles, they were up against a power in City Hall, in the Chambers of Commerce, the Employers Association, that was even stronger and more entrenched and more willing to use force and repression against the workers than in San Francisco or Seattle, where the ranks were the strongest.
I think from my point of view, what really made him different is he really cared about the workers and their conditions. He really felt it. We spent time in people's houses, that weren't very fancy, and he just loved it, and he was completely at home, and people could tell that he was and that he cared. And I think I told you when we talked before, one of the most incredible things that, from my point of view, is during some strike or something, when we were going to different plantations on different islands, some workers gave him this silver tray with the coffee pots and creamers and teapots and everything, because they wanted him to have the same thing that the bosses had. So I think that feeling was reciprocated. So I think that's what made him different. Not that there aren't other union leaders that have the same empathy and heart, but he for sure did.